Well, tonight we are going to be talking about condemnation that comes from God. I wonder how you feel about that when I say that word, the condemnation of God, the wrath of God. I think that our society, I'm going to say Western 21st century society, has come such a long way from where we were before. And we're just at a point where we don't like other people condemning other people. We don't like us condemning other people. And we're just pretty careful, I'd say mostly for better, of not being judgmental. We don't like judgmentalism. Judgmentalism and condemnation is not okay. And I'm saying for the most part, that's good that we've noticed that doing that to other people is not good. However, it can actually start to cloud our view of God, who is not just another person. God is different, completely and wholly different from what a human is. He's not just a bigger human with a louder voice, as one theologian put it. God is something different, and it is right for God to judge and right for God to condemn. I think you and I get a sense of this, although at first we shudder, and I do too, at the idea that God would condemn. But I think we get an idea of this when we realize and notice that sometimes it is good to judge. And sometimes condemnation is exactly what we actually long for. Like when a good judge in a good legal system makes a good judgment. That's a great moment. That's by no means a bad moment. But I do think that our society has realized there's some places where it's bad to condemn, but we do remember that there are some places where it's a good thing, okay? So that's the first thing I want to say, move that out of the way. The second thing, it's related. What I want to ask right here at the outset is, have you as a Christian come to terms with the fact that God judges and condemns? Have you come to terms with it? And maybe as a non-Christian person, you might be here thinking about faith, exploring what it is to follow Jesus. And I'm just going to say for you as well, this is something to come to terms with, the wrath of God. There is a thing called the wrath of God. Now, I live in a church house here at Bondi Beach. It's pretty fabulous. It's a pretty great setup. There's so much that I like about that house. But let me tell you something that bothers me and that I need to come to terms with. Whoever painted the house 35 or 50 years ago didn't put down drop sheets. And so wherever you wander around my house, the house that I get to live in, wherever you wander around, you'll see there's spatters of paint all over the place. And it's just a real shame. And actually, I'm glad to say one of our people who are on Zoom with us, Rahim, he's a painter and he knows this and he feels it at least. It's such a bummer when people haven't prepared and there's a paint spatter on the windowsill or on the floor. Such a shame. Okay, but I've just come to terms with it. You just don't focus on it. And I wonder if the wrath of God, the condemnation of God, is for you a little like that, the paint spatter, where you just kind of push it to the side because you don't like it very much and you just come to terms with it and don't think about it too much. I wonder if that's how you process it. But I want to suggest that's not a good thing to do with the wrath of God. You see, the wrath of God, the condemnation of God against sin is not like a paint spatter. It's more like a column in the middle of your house. I used to live in a house in Switzerland that was the middle central column of the house was an old tree. They fortified it at the bottom and they built the house around it and lent on it. And I want to suggest that the wrath of God is a bit more like a tree in the middle of your house or a column in the middle of your house, that you might not like it very much at first viewing and think, oh, you know, I think I'd like to get rid of that. And you get the chainsaw out or you get the sledgehammer out and you think, I'm going to get rid of that. But a good friend, an architectural friend, will say, no, don't get rid of that. That's holding the house up. The house relates to that quite significantly. And I'm suggesting, and I'm going to show you here in Romans chapter 1 and 2, that the wrath of God is not only central to the Christian faith, but it's good news. Just like that feeling we feel when we hear on the news, the good news that a judge has condemned with a good judgment. Okay, so we find ourselves in Romans chapter 1, and in chapter 1, verse 17, it says this. Verse 16 says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it is, and then he says some stuff that I'm not going to say, and then he says, in the gospel, a righteousness of God is revealed. And I think this is a central, perhaps the central sentence, or at least kind of the heading for the book of Romans. In the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed. Righteousness, bit of an old word, don't let that throw you, just get your mind around it. I've been thinking of it this week in terms of the integrity of God's character, the righteousness of God, the way that God deals rightly has been revealed in the gospel. The integrity of God's character is revealed in the gospel. And that's what I'm saying. Big heading for the whole letter of the Romans. The righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. And then he's going to take a number of chapters to explain how the gospel reveals the righteousness of God, the integrity of God's character. And so there's going to be a number of subpoints. And first subpoint, it's the very next line, verse 17, the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. Subpoint number 1, you ready? Here it is, verse 18. The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Okay, so big heading, the rightness of God, how God deals rightly is revealed in the gospel. Subsection number 1, notice that it also uses the reveal word. The wrath of God is being revealed. Okay? Part of the integrity of our God is that he is like a good judge who has integrity, that does not let a single sin go past him. He does not sweep a single one under the rug. Now, when I say sweep a sin under the rug, we're all thinking, a bit of laziness, but just think in terms of the righteousness of God. God sees every time a person is hurt by another person. That's what the righteousness of God revealed in his wrath is about. God sees every person that is gossiped about, and he cares and notices. God sees and hears every lie that is told. God sees each physical blow that is given against another human being. God sees rape and murder and slavery, and not a single one goes past him because he's righteous. And so the wrath of God is being revealed. Do you catch the logic of how Paul is now arguing for the righteousness of God? He's saying God reveals his wrath against all sin. Okay, and what follows here is Paul is now going to unpack God's wrath. And he's going to give you a Christian understanding of sin. Notice that this is, I'm almost definite, the longest exposition or kind of discussion of sin in the whole New Testament, where Paul just goes on and talks about sin. He's going to explain it. So I want you to take from this and add to your understanding and fortify, kind of make strong your understanding of your Christian faith as it's explained here. There is beautiful insight here for you in understanding yourself and the world and humanity. So listen, I'm going to point out 4 things about sin that he describes here. The first thing he says about sin is in verse 19 and 20, where he says that there's no excuse for sin. This is what you do with a judge, isn't it? To check that their judgments are right. You check first, is the person that they were judging, did they have any good excuses that are reasonable excuses that might excuse them from being punished? And the first thing that Paul does is say, there's no excuse for us humans. Now, how does he make that argument? Well, he says, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth. Okay, here you go. It's because people have suppressed the truth. He says that all humans are without excuse because we had the truth and we suppressed it. The best illustration I've heard about this is it's like someone who has a beach ball in the pool and they're trying to push it under the water. Now, it will come up, but they're suppressing it under the water. He says here there's a truth that all humans have knowingly and actively suppressed down. And what is the truth that they've suppressed that makes them without excuse? Verse 19, since what may be known about God is plain to them because God has made it plain to them. Okay, do you understand the logic as he unpacks it? We are without excuse, you and I, for sin, because what should be known about God is known plainly. God has given it to you. And then he explains how God has given you. And this is a really important part of understanding the way the Christian faith works. Okay, ready? He says in verse 20, because, or for, in the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that no people are without excuse. Do you hear what he's saying? He's saying that there's enough knowledge in nature, enough knowledge about what God is like and that there is a God, that you and I are culpable when we turn away from God. There's enough. And what is the actual particular knowledge that's in creation? Well, the creation doesn't tell you that there's three persons to our one God. And the creation, the ocean and stuff doesn't tell us that, Jesus is Lord. But it does tell you something. And he says there what it tells you. It tells you God's eternal power and his divine nature. And that's enough knowledge to make us culpable when we turn away from God and don't treat God as God. Okay, so the first thing we see here is that we are without excuse when it comes to knowledge of God. And everybody in the whole world, the Jewish nation and all the other nations of the world, are without excuse when it comes to knowledge of God. But the second thing that he shows us here about sin is that it's not mainly a list of things. Israel Folau famously put up a curated list of sins from the New Testament. But here in Romans, we find that sin is not mainly a list of things, arbitrary or otherwise. It's mainly a relational category. You see, it says, first of all, that it's a suppression of truth. Relational truth is suppressed. Secondly, there in verse 21, it says, although they knew God, they neither glorified him or gave him thanks. And then it goes on. And it's painting sins in relational terms mainly, or firstly, I should say, rather than giving you a list of sins to steer clear of. And this is the heart of sin, is to suppress the truth about God and not treat him as God. I had a profound moment when I read this at Bible college with a friend, and we realized that this tells you what it is that God wants from you. What is it that God is looking for from you and I? It's quite simple. It says it there in verse 21. He wants us to give him thanks and to glorify him. Now, again, if you try and illustrate or think of God as a person like you and I, then you think, oh, someone who wants to be glorified and given thanks to, that's a bit hungry. But it's not like that. God is just a different category of thing who by his nature and by your nature deserves your thanks and deserves you to treat him as God. And this is what God wants from us most of all. Now, there will come a list of sins. And Paul will, you heard some of them, and some of them are striking. Talks about not honoring and not listening to your parents. It's an interesting one, but it's just a full list of, not an exhaustive list, but quite a full list of all sorts of different sins. He talks about lying and slandering. He talks about homosexual sex. He talks about sex outside of marriage. He talks about murder, talks about hatred and all sorts of the different ways that we sin. But what I'm saying to you now is that these things are a product of our sin. First of all, our sin is turning away from the God who loves us, who made us as a reflection of his glory, and just doing our own thing. The third thing that I want you to see in this passage here about sin and God's judgment is that sinning is its own worst punishment. Sinning is its own worst punishment. You'll find here that there's quite a cyclical argument going on, not a cyclical argument, actually a cyclical process where it will repeat the same idea. And that is the idea that God hands you over to your sin. God hands us over. Listen, it says in verse 21 that when we suppress the truth and stop living with our Creator as our Creator, this is what happens. Ready? Listen to the repetition. Our foolish hearts were darkened. And then in verse 24, God gave them over. And then in verse 28, God gave them over again. It's like when we turn away from God, he leaves us to do what we want. It's kind of like the parent who says, it's time to go now, and the child doesn't listen, and the child says, okay, well, I'm going. And the child thinks, oh, that's the worst thing that could possibly happen, is to be left alone. And in the same way, here we see that sin is its own worst punishment. And I want you to hear what this says. And when you see suffering in the world, and when you see the brokenness of the world, and when you see the world falling apart in all sorts of ways, notice that this is part of the judgment of God. Because in verse 18, it says the wrath of God is being revealed right now. It is being revealed. Now, we must never draw a one-to-one line between somebody's suffering or pain and say, oh, well, they must have deserved that. That's not what this is saying. This is saying that humanity turning away from God has caused a rift in kind of the fabric of our nature and the nature of the world that now means that those things are full of suffering and pain, but it is never our job. And it's often not true that there is a one-for-one correlation between somebody's mistakes and their sin. Now, sometimes there are correlations, aren't there? We can see that drunk driving and you crash your car. That's a pretty close correlation, but that's not what this is saying. One-for-one correlation. It's not saying that. It's saying that our sin, our turning away from God, has broken things. Notice the language. Our foolish hearts were darkened. God gave us over. God gave us over. Sin is its own worst punishment, where you're left to the very things that you chose. There's a bishop in Sydney called Bishop Chris Edwards, and he tells a story of when he was, I can't remember, 5 or 10, with his brother, who was also 5 or 10, around that age. And one November, they stumbled, I don't know how they stumbled, across their Christmas presents, all wrapped up and hidden in the top shelf of one of the cupboards. And so he says that they pulled out the ladder, and together with each other's help, they climbed up and pulled the Christmas presents out, and they just started to unwrap them. And their mum walked in, and their mum says, "What are you doing?" And the boys say, "Oh, sorry, mum, we'll wrap it back up." And they start getting the sticky tape out to wrap it back up. And their mum gave them the worst punishment possible. She said, no, you just enjoy them now. There'll be no Christmas this year. We're not celebrating Christmas. You enjoy them on your own. Whew. I think that's good parenting. What she did was she gave them exactly what they asked for, and they would learn that life's not very good when you try and do it on your own. And in the same way, this says that God punishes sin by leaving us to our own desires. Okay. Fourth thing that I'm going to show you here from Romans chapter 1 about sin is there is a theology of exchange, Again, there's a repetition of the language of exchange. It says in verse 22 that part of sin is exchanging the glory of God for a lie. And verse 25 says that it's exchanging the truth of God. And verse 26 says there's an exchange of natural sexual relations. Paul is using the idea of swapping and a bad swap here to help us understand the nature of sin. He says that sin is when we take a good thing and we hand it over and we get something that's worth less. That's the nature of sin. So you know the old trick. I've never done it. I promise I've never done it, but you might have done it or had someone do it to you. When a 3-year-old has a $2 coin and you have a 50-cent coin. I haven't done this. I've just heard it done. And you say to the 2-year-old, 3-year-old, "Hey, do you want to swap me your small little coin for my big shiny coin that has nice sharp edges?" I don't know how many edges there are on a 50-cent coin, but there's lots. "Do you want to swap me a big one for your little one?" And there's an exchange that goes on, but the child is being ripped off, and that's why you mustn't do it, because it's a poor swap. You get less by doing that swap. And I want you to hear this. And if you'll allow me, I even want you to apply this to your own sin, those ways that you go out from God's way. Just notice, what is it that you're trying to get? Because the Bible says here that you're going to get less than you could have gotten by choosing sin. Sin is always a choice for something less. Jeremiah chapter 2 says that sin has a nature which is like trying to get fresh water from a broken cistern instead of going to a living fountain. And that's what we see here where it says that we've exchanged. And particularly it says, so what is the exchange? Instead of looking up to God to receive our purpose and our peace and our fulfillment, we look down the created order to animals and lizards and things. And we try and get our purpose from the things around us. Now, you and I would never commit idolatry of worshiping a statue. Well, hopefully not. But this is a thing that's all too familiar to us. We set our purpose and our fulfillment based on created things rather than the creator. And it's a poor swap. And Paul is saying that's the nature of sin, is where you get the order of things wrong. Instead of looking up to the Lord your God and receiving fulfillment from him, you look down to created things that were supposed to be beneath you. Notice that in the garden story of Genesis chapter 1, we are put in charge of created things by naming them. And this is a reversal of Genesis. Okay. Big heading is the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. Subheading, the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. Paul is defending that God does not overlook sin, and he shouldn't. Look how he does. Look how he doesn't overlook sin. Look how he judges sin. That's what it says here. But now he's going to move on to a new subpoint. Because do you know what happens when we set rules, or whenever anybody makes a judgment? The goody-goodies start pointing out and making fun of the people who have not done well. And so Paul now turns to those people who think they're better. He does it in a kind of general sense, and then he's going to talk about a particular group of Jews who were doing this. Who said, yeah, we've got the Old Testament law and we know God's way, and so we're God's people and you're condemned and we're not. Well, Paul turns now to them and says, look, God is righteous for judging those who don't have the law because they do have knowledge of God from nature, but he's also righteous because he's going to judge all people who do have the law but still don't keep it. I'm going to be much more brief on this, but you ought to read chapter 2 all the way to chapter 3, verse 20 and see this at work. I'm just going to pull out 4 places where he does this. You see in chapter 2, verse 17, where he says, now, if you call yourself a Jew, if you rely on the law and brag about your relationship to God, do you see what he's highlighting there? He's saying, yeah, sure, God's righteousness is condemning of ungodly people who don't have the law, but you're bragging about having the law, but you don't keep it. Or in chapter 2, verse 23, he says, you brag about the law, but you dishonor God by breaking the law. Or in chapter 2, verse 12, he says, all who sin apart from the law will perish apart from the law, but also who sin under the law will perish under the law. And what he's saying is that God is righteous to those who've been given knowledge from nature in his judgment, and he's righteous to those who've been given knowledge of God by the law. And if you do the wrong thing, and if you ignore him and push him out, then you'll be judged either way. And so Paul is upholding the integrity of God's character in his judgment of sin wherever he sees it. It says here, God doesn't show favoritism. Now, this is an exposition of the good news. That this is saying this is good news. And I think we get a sense of that. But doesn't your stomach a little bit go, well, actually, this sounds like bad news to me? Because at least me, I'm getting judged by this word here, either as someone under the law or not under the law. I don't treat God properly. I don't honor him and give him thanks. And so you got kind of find yourself, I find myself asking, well, is this kind of feels like bad good news? Bad good news. And there's a sense that that's true. And yet the argument of the letter of Romans is going to continue. And in chapter 3, verse 21, it says this, but now. So he tells us the kind of bad good news. I'm glad God's judging fairly and there's integrity in his judgment, but it doesn't work out very well for me because of how I've been. But then in chapter 3, he says, but now, and he's going to use the revealed language again. Ready? Listen. But now, a righteousness from God, apart from the law, has been made known. Okay, big heading of Romans. The righteousness of God is revealed. Subsection 1, it's revealed in his wrath. Subsection number 2 is now chapter 3, verse 21. But now there's another kind of righteousness that's kind of different from the one that is about the law of God and the condemnation of God. But he goes on and he says, but the law was testified to it. The law spoke about it and foreshadowed it. But there is a different kind of righteousness that can be known from God. And you and I, if you're a Christian person, we know this, don't we? Because our Christian faith is not so much about the condemnation of God, although that would be right, because we all haven't given him thanks and glorified him and treated him as God. Our Christian faith, the good news, is that God has done a different kind of exchange. Not a different one, the same kind of terrible exchange that you and I do all the time, where God, who is above, and God, who deserves honor and grace, has come down low and exchanged us and brought us up high in God's sight. This is what was happening in Jesus. The Creator came into creation and put himself at our power, and we killed him. And he did this, he orchestrated this on purpose, that there might be a great exchange, that you and I might get what Jesus deserves, and Jesus got what we deserved. There is a terrible exchange that happens in the gospel that makes the good news very good news for you and I. And that's the reason that we can be saved. Now, I'm not going to say too much about that, but Paul will, and because actually, once I start talking about this, you think, is that fair that someone else gets what I deserve? And Paul's going to get into that with many, many words. And Martin, on my screen just here, is going to get into that with many, many words next week as well. But I couldn't finish with only the bad good news. And I wanted to foreshadow and show you the logic about how the righteousness of God is being revealed. Firstly, in his condemnation of sin, that's good. But secondly, in this other way of righteousness that is apart from the law. Okay, I'm going to come back to a similar place where I started, about how we Western 21st century dwellers find this quite confronting. And we want to kind of, not focus on it too much. And I get that in many ways. I mean, that is me as well in many ways. But I want to just encourage you with a short story about Rahim, who's with us here on the Zoom call today. He's there somewhere. Because Rahim's from another part of the world, and the beautiful thing about people that are different to you is they notice different truths. They notice different truths. And the beautiful story is that before Rahim became a Christian, he followed his brother to an Alpha course. His brother Yasser said, hey, and it took a lot of prayer and courage to do this. Yasser said, Rahim, my brother, I know you don't like the Christian stuff, but come with me and look at this thing. And so he came, and I was a bit worried by this huge muscly guy who I knew didn't like the Christian thing. And he came and sat down in the living room, and it was week 1 of Alpha. And in week 1 of Alpha, it's a video course where they're explaining the Christian faith. They just do their best, and they do a great job of pointing out just the beautiful parts of the Christian faith that are very easy to grasp, and the things that we desire, like purpose and meaning. And they just lay it out beautifully with examples. Okay, and so I can see the people in the Alpha group are like, they're really engaged and enjoying this and thinking, yeah, I do want purpose. And maybe God does have something to give me like that. And I love that he loves me. That sounds good. Okay, but Rahim's sitting in the corner, and Rahim says to me when the video finishes, he says, like this actually. Tell me, my friend, does your God judge evil? Tell me, my friend, does your God judge evil? That was Rahim's one question that he wanted to know as he thought about God. And that's because he comes from a different place where they see things differently and they see truths that maybe you and I are slow to see. And now I'm just going to speculate. I wonder if it's because the place that Rahim is from is maybe a little more aware of the brokenness of the world and sees up close and often some of the terrible things that happen, and maybe even in their history are more acquainted with seeing evil things happen. And so their correct question, at least Rahim's very correct question was, does your God judge evil? I need to know. I can't follow a God who doesn't judge evil. And so I want to encourage you, if you feel a little angsty when we hear about the condemnation of God, to just notice the terrors in our world and feel a bit of thankfulness that we have a God who judges evil. Now, he doesn't only judge evil. He doesn't do less. But now a righteousness of God, apart from the law, has been made known. And the law testified to it, and it doesn't disqualify God's judgment of sin and evil, but it adds beautiful grace. And that's where we'll go next in the letter.